so many people who have kind of pivoted into behavioral science, right? But
Mhm.
the folks who've been in it longer often have very traditional. I mean, you were, psychology, then org psych, right? Then a PhD in org psych, right? Like it was a very traditional psychology path. Like you were born loving psychology. Like where did this? What happened? Like where did this seed germinate for you?
You know, I was just thinking about yesterday, my high school offered a psychology course and I didn't take it because I was so obsessed with performance and it wasn't AP. And like the way that they did GPA, you got more credit for an AP course. And so I'm like, I'm not going to screw my GPA by taking this psych course, even though it could be awesome. I went into college thinking I was going to study English and then didn't really enjoy that. And I had to, like, at the time, I did my undergrad at Harvard. And at the time, they've since changed this very fortunately. You had to declare your major at the end of your first semester. So I loaded up on English courses that first semester, realized that I was ruining my love of reading by making it my job. And I had a roommate who said, you know, my sister loves English. She also loves psychology. Why don't you declare psychology? And so I took my first psych course after I was officially a psych major.
That's amazing. But I want to go back a second. Hold on. So what I heard was in high school, you had the promoting pressure. You were, it's not like you were like psychology. No, you were like psychology, but then the inhibiting pressure of it's going to screw into. So there was some notion that humans were fascinating early.
Yeah,
right?
and I think it's actually related to why I love fiction and literature so much because I see it as a way to understand human beings. You know, it's a way to like role play and really develop empathy and understand different walks of life. But yeah, I was interested in psychology. And I think that's also why I was open to my roommate's suggestion, because if she had said, hey, my sister loves English and chemistry, I wouldn't have bid at that.
I love that. And, one of the nice things about doing these firesides is you get to start to see some of the patterns. I have noticed that there is sort of a love of fiction among sort of behavioral scientists. I think part of it has to do with that living, when you're doing applied behavioral science, you're trying to create a different world. You're trying to create something that doesn't yet exist, a world of behavior that doesn't yet exist. So we live in the fictional all the time in our work. And there is something about that, I definitely went into college going like, yeah, maybe English, like maybe I'll be a writer, right? And instead, I became a different kind of writer in the form of applied behavioral science.
Yeah.
So you've declared for psychology, even having not taken a psych class. Like, you take it and you fall in love, or you take it and you go, oh man, maybe I might have made a mistake.
Well, all right. I very rarely talk about this, and I don't think I've ever talked about this publicly. So I took 2 psych courses my first semester. I took Intro to Psychology, Psych 1, and I took Intro to Personality Psychology. So Intro to Psych 1, my professor was Richard Hackman. If you are an organizational person, you have probably heard of Hackman and the Hackman-Oldham model of jobs. It's a motivational theory about what gets people going at work. Richard Hackman was a fabulous professor. Loved his course, loved his lectures. Intro to Personality Psych at the time was taught by Jordan B. Peterson. I've never taken another personality psych course.
Oh my God.
So it was a mixed bag. I learned really quickly that there were subfields of psychology and I wasn't going to be interested in all of them.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. I had the opposite. I took Intro to Psych and then Psychology of Self-Control. And Intro to Psych was taught by a fantastic research professor who couldn't teach his way out of a bag. And then Psych of Self-Control was taught by Andrew Ward, who's like a legendary teacher and amazing, right? It is that. So you took Intro Psych, you had that spark. Like, did you go immediately into a lab in undergrad? You just started taking more classes? Like, where did that spark go?
Both. So I was a semester behind on my major because I had thought I was going to do English. I also spent a lot of my electives as a consequence, like things I thought would be classes for my major became electives, which was unfortunate. In my sophomore year, I enrolled in a course which essentially was joining a lab. It was an organized way to affiliate students with labs. And so I ended up working in Dr. Nalini Ambody's lab. So she's was a social psychologist. She passed away, over a decade ago, which was, she's a wonderful, wonderful person and really instrumental in my career and my path. But ended up doing research in her lab. I was working with 2 of her grad students, Margaret Shee and Todd Patinsky. Margaret ended up becoming faculty at University of Michigan, which was a big reason why I ended up going there as well. But at the same time, I continued taking courses and trying to figure out, what specifically do I want to do within this field? What's interesting to me? I took a lot of developmental psych courses around the same time, even though I was doing social psych research. I was flirting with that area, ultimately ended up going more the social route. And I think because I was getting the chance to do applied research and really see what that was like.
Got it. So that early experience to research sort of nudged you towards the social side as opposed to the toward of the developmental side.
Yeah.
And did you like you were like, and I'm clearly going on and doing this master's PhD thing, or was that a decision?
So actually Nalini was really helpful in that. I loved, eventually grew to really love psychology through my undergrad. And as I was starting to think about job prospects, not a lot of hits, not a lot of things that you can use an undergrad degree in psychology to do where you would actually be doing psychology. And so Nalini was like, go to grad school. She thought I had the skill set to do it. She had supervised my senior thesis. And so she'd seen me do some independent research. I remember sitting in her office on her couch, and she actually, verbalized a list of the schools I should apply to. And I just used that as my list. I didn't even do my own research about which schools, but she's like, these are places where there are faculty members who would be good mentors to you, where I think you would really fit in with the department. So there's maybe like 10 schools. And yeah, I just applied to those 10 schools, and there it was.
That is, I love the themes that I had the same experience with Andrew Wardenberry Schwartz, who basically sat down and said, who's crazy enough to work with Matt? They were like, what advisors in a PhD program will not think you're totally insane?
Right.
Like, they just made a list. They were like, okay, here's a list of like 10 social psychologists that you will jive with. And then that pretty much defined where I pursued.
Yeah. And for me too, it was also, it's such a hard thing to go into grad school. I feel like there's a huge identity crisis, and part of the whole ethos, at least when I went at grad school, is like, they're going to tear you down to rebuild you. Having the confidence of a faculty member that I really trusted to put me in that place, I'm not sure I would have survived without it. Like I found myself being like, okay, Nalini thinks I can do this. I don't want to let her down.
Yeah. Did you, while you were there, did you have an inkling that you might want to go off and do applied? I mean, it sounds like you knew early that you came out of undergrad going like, I want to do applied stuff, and then more saw the PhD as a gating factor to doing the applied stuff. Was that, I knew in some department, were you honest with your department about that? Because I know some departments are like, thou shalt not apply, thou shalt only stay in the academe. Was that static for you, or how did you experience that?
So I really realized it around my third year. So after I'd completed the master's, I'd gone through all the prelim exams and stuff. And it's really funny. I was recently reorganizing my home office, and I have, I failed the prelim exam the first time around. It was like a written exam, and I got creative with it. That was not appreciated. I had to retake it. But I was reading the feedback on it, and that feedback, I remember at the time being so upset, and, again, big confidence shake, but it was basically like, Amy seems really interested in the applied stuff. She's really not leaning into the like underlying, conceptual mechanisms and knowledge generation. And I'm looking at this now going, okay, yeah, that's right. And I'm no longer offended by it. At the time, I took it like, oh, I don't belong here. So yeah, around my third year, when I was doing my own independent research, I was just noticing that the things that really got me excited were more like, how would this actually help somebody perform better? How would this make somebody happier? How would this help somebody have a better life in some way? And I did start to socialize that a little bit. And it was kind of similar to undergrad, actually, where I tried to do what I felt was expected of me. I, was looking at faculty jobs. I did end up even applying to some. I withdrew from one interview for a faculty position because I could feel in my body that wasn't what I actually wanted to do, and I didn't want to waste my or their time. But it was hard because, like you remember, we were around the same time. Like, there weren't a lot of jobs out there that clearly were looking for applied BeSci. And I remember even going to the careers office at University of Michigan, and the counselor I sat down with said, we don't get a lot of PhDs from the social sciences who are looking for industry jobs. I don't really have any ideas for you. Maybe look at Procter & Gamble. They might hire people like that.
So that's interesting. It's sort of a company specific. They're like, they had a vague idea that companies of a certain type might be interested.
Right.
But not necessarily what you would do at, sort of no idea what you would do at that company.
Yeah. And I mean, similarly, talking to my advisor, and one of the things I did do around that time, because for the academic job market, there's this sort of emphasis on going deep and becoming like the world expert on a very specific question. Sure. Once I realized I didn't want to do that, I'm also not like, I am more of a generalist. I like working broadly. I like variety. And so I started working with multiple faculty advisors, which is not usual, but it's like, these people are doing interesting research. I want to learn different methods. I want to get deep into different topics. And I was asking all these different advisors for help and advice, and they were all academics themselves, and they had no advice for me. They were like, I have only lived my one career path, and this is it.
This is it. This is the career path I know.
Yeah. So I definitely had this like constant sense that I was letting people down. I wasn't repaying the investment they'd made in me by carrying their research forward into the academy. But I also was at that point, I can be stubborn. I knew what I wanted for myself. I was imagining this future where I was like, a single 20-something woman living really far away from friends and family, and like just did not want that for myself badly enough that I was willing to disappoint people.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things I love about you is your fortitude, right? Like, like so many things, you can look at a personal characteristic, and you can sort of put it in a negative light. Stubborn is the negative version, sort of persistent is the positive version.
Mm-hmm.
I can see where that persistence really helped you sort of get out. And were you applying to Big at the same time that you were applying to faculty jobs? So you're like considering them next to each other? Or you sort of did the faculty thing, said, I know it's not this, and then went and did the industry?
So more that way, because the faculty, the calendar for applying to those is a little bit earlier. I was applying prior to finishing and defending my dissertation. It would have been like my last year of grad school that I would have been doing all that interviewing. So I did a seminar at Michigan called Preparing Future Faculty, which was actually really, I'm glad I did it. I think it actually helped me in my industry life too. It had a lot of emphasis on sort of articulating what you're about, thinking about diversity and inclusion in the way that you structure and work with teams, which has certainly been a helpful thing. I mean, obviously that's universal. But yeah, I put together my job packets, sent it out to a bunch of schools. I did get the one interview, and it was like, as soon as I saw that I might have some success in that job market, honestly, like the terrible feeling in my stomach, like, oh, nope, can't do this.
Yeah.
So what I did is I negotiated an extra semester of pay. I taught an extra semester over what I was obligated to do, and they agreed to extend my pay into the summer after I finished. The caveat was I couldn't defend on time to do a spring graduation, so that I could still technically be a student over the summer. So I defended the day after the deadline on purpose, and that way I got paid for my job search, basically.
That's awesome. And you ended up at Big. Were there other folks in the mix? This was kind of like the one and only, like
that. I had 2 job offers, and I'm glad I took that one. The other one was for a company. So Big has been acquired since then and shuttered. And just for folks who don't know, it was Big Communications. It was in Michigan, and it was a like an agency that primarily worked with pharmaceutical companies, and their overall focus was really on those quarterly or sometimes biannual meetings they do, called plan of action meetings, where they will roll out all their new marketing materials to their sales reps. And, these are our new products, and this is how you talk about it. And they tend to be very hypey. They're kind of like a reason why the pharma industry gets a bad rap, in my opinion. Like, lots of money spent on the glitz and the glamour of it, and less on the substance. And so Big was responsible for doing a lot of that glitz and glamour, and but I was hired into their innovation team, and it was about let's do research to figure out where we could add additional value to our healthcare clients. So I kind of hated the job, honestly, but it taught me that healthcare is a really good place to do applied behavior science. I did feel like it was really hard for me to be a behavioral scientist in that work environment, because that wasn't really what they just weren't looking at me with that skill set. They were just thinking I was somebody who could like do focus groups and things, and not really thinking about the additional value that my training might bring to that.
And did you, that's a fractious thing, right? When you're in an environment and they're not using all of you.
Mm-hmm.
Did you, I know you were only there about, 2 years.
Yeah, a little less.
Did you see kind of early on, like, hey, this is going to be a stepping stone and maybe not like a thing? Or were you in your in your high GPA sort of way, just like, this is what they're expecting of me, and I'm going to try and do the thing they're expecting of me?
Something in between. I knew I wasn't happy with it. But I wasn't sure if it was me. Is this something I'm going to find in any job? It was my first job. I didn't know if that was like just something about the working world, or is it something about this particular job? So I was unhappy enough to be open to other opportunities, but not sure. I think if I hadn't lucked into finding my next role and having it be such a spectacular fit, I bet I would have persisted there a bit longer and just sort of continued to self-doubt.
And did you know that the sort of health media role was like, you like talked to him and you were like, yep, that.
I did. I remember. So I found health media. So it was through my role at Big. I was doing also, they called it trend spotting, which was also weird, but like market research. What else is out there? What are people doing in health? And I found one of the health media programs that they built. So they did digital health coaching. And for some reason, they had built one for Takeda for diabetes management called Takeda Cares. And it was ungated. It was just available online. So I went through and took the program, and I could tell what they were doing in terms of the questions. So it was like a self-report questionnaire to open up with a lot of questions about what are your behavioral patterns, what are the motivations behind them, what's your level of self-efficacy, and then it tailored a coaching plan for you based on that. And with my background, I could tell what was happening. I was like, oh, this is so cool. So they had opened a role, and they were also 2 miles from my house. I had a really long commute to get to Big, and health media was 2 miles from my house. So they opened a content developer role. And as soon as I saw it, I applied. And I remember like after the first interview, I just knew, like I knew that this was a company I wanted to work for. I knew I would be good at the job. I knew that they saw it too. Like the way that the rapport between me and my colleagues felt so good. So that was just such a turning point, such a change in my career.
That's so interesting. I love that you found them. You know, I think people don't utilize this enough, right? I try and, you know, people are like, I don't know where I want to work. I'm like, well, find things that you love, right? Like find the work product that you love, and then you'll find, you know, then, you know, if you love what people, it's very rare in my life that people create something I love and then I meet them and go, wow, you're a terrible person. It happens sometimes, but most of the time you're like, hey, if I like what you created, it turns out I like the process that you're using in creation, because it is reflective, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, what you do comes out in what you create.
Well, and it's on that point too. One of the things I've been thinking, like early in my career, I felt like I was not consistent, like I was hopping around a little bit and maybe not focused. But now that I'm 20 years in and I look back, I do see a coherent story. And I think it's because when I had the opportunity, I followed the thing that I really love or enjoy. And there's some coherence to me as a person. And so over time, that starts to come out in your story, even though in any like little snapshot, it might not be as apparent.
Yeah, I love that point, right? That if you're following your instincts, you know, and, you know, we change. I was talking yesterday with a mentee about, you know, you should be sort of horrified by your past self, right? That's what growth is. Growth is going, wow, I really didn't know what I was doing back then, and I know better now. And then also recognizing that 10 years from now, I'm sure both you and I will look back at, you know, 41-year-old Matt Waller and go, man, that guy didn't know what he was doing, right? And that's good. That's what growth is. That's
right. Right.
But to your point, underlying even that change, there's some things that don't change, right? There's a, you know, it sounds like both you and I from an undergraduate level were like, hey, science is a thing. I really like, you know, I like this orderly approach to creating, you know, a fictional world, to creating the world that I want, that it's going to be high. You know, those are personality characters, values that probably aren't very amenable to change over time.
Right. Yeah, and especially the values piece too. I think if you really care about something, the way that that gets expressed might change over time, but chances are you're going to continue to care about that thing.
Yeah, 100%. And so now you're in health media, right? And how long were you there before they became a Johnson & Johnson sort of? Because I know they got acquired.
Yeah, they did. It was actually in my first year that they got acquired, but it was a really slow roll to change. Like J&J, it was probably a full 3 years before J&J like fully assimilated us, changed the name. They really let us continue to run as health media for quite a while. So the transaction happened fairly early on for me, but the transition felt like it was later.
Got it. And then, you know, at some point this is the place where you use the words behavioral scientist, right? Suddenly it happens. Tell me about that merge, because you were like 3 years in at that point, right? When you sort of like started to use the nomenclature.
Yeah. So one of the things, I joined health media as a content developer, and that actually didn't last very long for two reasons. One is it was a startup, and I'm in a startup again, and there's a lot of change sometimes in terms of what your role is, where you fit. Like you need to be kind of flexible about how you can best serve the product and the organization. So that was one dynamic. But the other was that I was a trained behavioral scientist, and health media had a behavior science team. So I really love, to this day, working with the product. And I fought to remain on the product team, even though, there was a lens that said I belonged on the behavior science team. They were very focused on research. They were very focused on outcomes and data in a way that, and, I wanted to be working more on the front end of let's do formative research. Let's figure out how to develop this product. Eventually I ended up sitting in the behavior science team, but I was the product focused behavior science person. So I did maintain that focus throughout my time, but there was like a lot of back and forth. You know, do I have a dotted line into behavior science but sit in product? Do I sit in behavior science with the dotted line to product?
Yeah, got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like the behavioral scientists were more on the, I'm going to call it the academic side, but I don't mean that puratively, but I mean sort of like, you know, it sounded like that was more evaluative research rather than sort of, you know, making decisions about what was going to happen.
Yeah, mixed. There were a couple of different behavioral scientists there who've actually been really influential. You know, I would three of them I would consider mentors, and one of them, Dr. Kevin Wildenhouse, he would do sort of evaluative research with an eye towards how this would improve the product. So not really what I would consider product formative research, like not starting from that space, but once there was a product out in market, what are we learning from how people interact with it that then has implications for improvements? The other thing that was kind of cool for me is that all three of those guys at the time, well, still, they're clinical psychologists, which is not my background. And so I have a real appreciation for our similarities and differences as professionals and like where I really need to work with that subject matter expertise versus where I can do a little bit of it myself. So learned a ton from them.
Yeah, I think, and that is, I gave a talk at the APA once about like, please stop ignoring everything. You know, they're very clinical psych folk. I'm like, come on, there's like all sorts of other things we do with this here. Like social psychologists go out into the industry and do things, right? Like we don't all become clinical psychologists.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, having been married to a clinical psychologist and now partnered with a clinical psychologist, there is that interesting sort of like, I half understand what you're doing and you half understand what I'm doing. And that level of overlap is interesting and important, but also highlights the difference, right? Highlights that specialization that you have.
Mm-hmm.
So you're at J&J, you like do this thing, and at some point you decide, like, you know, you're gonna go over to CVS, which didn't last a terribly long time.
No. I loved J&J. I really did, and I would have stayed there longer. But so behind the scenes, you know, my husband finished his Ph.D. in 2010. Also at University of Michigan. That was actually another factor in my decision not to go on the academic job market. We had just met, we got engaged right after I defended my dissertation. You know, I didn't want to have a long distance relationship. I was lucky to be able to really start that health media career in Michigan. But then in 2010, we decided we wanted to move to Boston, which is where I'm from. You know, he had a great job opportunity and J&J was open to me being remote before that was really a thing. But what I found, because it wasn't really a thing, like there wasn't a remote first sort of mindset, I could just see that my influence in the organization and my ability to really be influenced by others was getting less and less over time. I did hotel. So J&J has an innovation office in Cambridge really close to me. And I was able to sit there and that team was wonderful, like really welcoming and supportive and everything. But they're more on the investment side and more focused on like biology. You know, they're out there investing in molecules that might become pharmaceutical products. So in terms of like, you know, someone to talk behavioral stuff with, there was no one there. And I could just kind of see the writing on the wall. Like this is not going to be a growth opportunity for me remote. So CVS had opened the Digital Innovation Lab in Boston around that time. And I, you know, got an offer to join. And what I didn't like about it is it was their first foray into digital innovation. And they did that thing that I've seen a lot of companies do where they were just trying to like bolt creative people into their existing processes.
Yeah.
So I found it really, really hard to get things done. I thought that the culture was very much like you have a job and you do your job and you do only your job, where again, you know, I'm coming from more of a startup mentality where it's like you pitch in where you think you can add value and you are flexible and creative. And that just really wasn't the expectation or what was rewarded there. So I really felt, it wasn't for me.
So you started agency, right? And then you kind of end up in these in-house roles. And then you go to Mad Pow, which, right? Mm-hmm. So you're back to agency side.
Yep.
Tell me about that. You know, those are very different lives, right? That sort of agency life versus inside life is very different. was that a conscious change? Like, tell me a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, well, it was a conscious change, and I will say I don't find it's always that different. So after the J&J acquisition, I was still part of the health media organization, but increasingly over time, J&J, they changed us first to wellness and prevention. Under that umbrella, we were more like a shared service inside J&J. So I got to work globally across all three of their divisions at the time. So consumer, medical devices, and pharma. It was almost like being in an agency internal to J&J.
Yeah.
And I liked it a lot. Because again, I like variety, I like breadth, and you get that in an agency engagement.
So you like that diversity part?
I do. I do.
You like the and there, to your point, there are a lot of roles inside of companies that are sort of more agency-like. You're contributing across a larger number of teams and sort of getting to look at a larger number of things. Is that something you sort of came to know about yourself, or did you know that early? You were like, I like the diversity, and I know, because you mentioned all the way back in grad school, you're like, hey, I'm working with different professors, I'm working on different things.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know consciously, like, I like diversity and agency is the place to get it, or was that more of a passive learning?
I think I really realized it about myself at Mad Pow. So I did subconsciously know it. I can see that I was seeking out opportunities to lean into that breadth and variety, but it was at Mad Pow that I'm like, oh, this is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I became aware of Mad Pow in 2010 because they used to host the Health Experience. I think it was Health Experience Refactored at the time, HXR, and then it became HXD. And I attended the inaugural one and had that sense of like, these are my people. Like, I love what they're doing. It's so applied. Dustin DiTomaso had started the behavior change design arm of Mad Pow, and the work that he did was so cool. And so I would attend like any event that had a Mad Pow section. Like, I was sort of a stalker for a couple of years, so that by the time I was looking for that next role, I actually had a relationship with a lot of people who were there. Always tried to use my educational dollars to go to the Mad Pow conferences and things. So it felt like a very natural progression.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. And so you had this, Steph Beef has the same sort of story, right? Long relationship with someone before really deciding that it was the thing to do. So you hit CVS, go, these are not my people. And at the same time, you've had this relationship, with Mad Pow for, 6 years or whatever. How did that sort of, did you go to them? Did they come to you? You kind of mutually found each other at drinks and were like, hey.
Actually, that last one's not far off. So at the time that I started at CVS, I also had a job offer from Mad Pow. I had done the formal, send in my application, go through the interview process. They made me an offer. And I chose CVS because, the benefits and stuff were stronger at the time. And it felt similar to I thought it would be similar to J&J. And like I said, I really liked working at J&J. It felt like a similar size. Like, I was expecting a continuation of J&J. And when I realized that wasn't going to work out, Dustin and I had just stayed in touch because, again, I had this relationship and we got together for drinks. And I'm sitting at the bar next to him, I'm like, dude, I'm so miserable. Like, I hate it. And he was like, well, if I could make it happen, would you reconsider joining us? And that was really where it started. And I actually feel very lucky, even though CVS didn't work out, that it happened that way. Because first of all, I know Mad Pow experienced some hard times in that year that I was at CVS and did some layoffs. And I think I probably would have been vulnerable to that being a newer employee. But also, I did learn a lot at CVS, and they hired a lot of cool people for that digital innovation lab. I'm still in touch with a lot of them. There's nothing like a hard work situation to forge lifelong friendships. So I feel like I walked away with, some knowledge, some good friends, and probably avoided, an unwanted separation from Mad Pow. Like, I entered that company at a better time.
I love that. I love that you can, I think there's a lot of times people look at, oh, well, I went somewhere and it didn't really work out, and that just seems like wasted time, right? It's like relationships where people are like, we broke up and so it was wasted time. I'm like, no, you learned something from that time, right? Like, if the definition of a successful relationship is one in which you don't leave, then you can only have one unless someone dies, right? Like, that's the whole idea. Our negative experiences at work are part of what form us, particularly as behavioral scientists, right? Because, we are experimenters. You have to have that sense that experimentation, right? That you're trying things and having them work or not work. I love that. And so you came into Mad Pow feeling like, hey, these are my people. I've just come off something where I know, like, wasn't the right thing. And then you were at Mad Pow for a long time.
Yeah.
Eventually becoming the VP. Tell me a little bit about, sort of like what kept you I mean, behavioral scientists tend to move around a lot, I think partially because of, we like the variety. What kept you there for so long? Tell me about it.
It was a rich learning opportunity. And I don't know if you've experienced this, like at your time at Frog, but working with consultants with different training, I felt like I was learning a ton from my colleagues, user experience researchers. It's a different type of research than what I was trained doing. And I've learned a lot about, what they do. And again, places where I can kind of gather, use some of those skills myself. My approach to research was changed by that. Service designers, thinking about systems more in the way that I do my work, which I think should be more of a part of behavioral science than it is. So learning from my colleagues was a big one. And I'll say, the Mad Pow alumni community keeps in touch, and I continue to learn a ton from those people, just fantastic, fantastic colleagues. And then we're getting the variety in the projects too, because as a consultant, you're rarely on a single project for more than a few months at a time. And that's actually why I started to be able to articulate about myself that I like this. And it was especially around when I was staffed to a project that I didn't find inherently interesting. I would challenge myself, is there one thing that I can learn from this project and either apply it to my work or my personal life? And also, it's not going to last forever. And so if I could keep those two things in mind, I found that it was okay to have projects that maybe weren't what I would have chosen.
Yeah. I love that, again, there's that framing piece, right? You're using this positive framing to contextualize an experience that you're having to sort of create that piece. Did you talk to other companies? I mean, were you ever tempted along the journey to sort of go in-house somewhere?
Oh yeah. I did a couple of, interviews. There were a couple times over the years where I put out applications. I never made it super, super far until the very end when I was in earnest starting to look for my next opportunity. But yeah, I was tempted. And I think it was less about being in-house and more about nostalgia for those health media years. I really loved that job. I loved being part of that company. And even after the acquisition, I really enjoyed being part of J&J. So yeah, I think I was trying to recapture that magic at times.
Yeah, it is hard to go backwards. I mean, even to your point about Mad Pow, and we can talk about your transition to Lirio in a second, right? There's a time and place convergence, right? It's not just the place, right? There are magical years in things, and so when you I'm sure if you went back to J&J now, you probably wouldn't find it the same place.
No.
And so what really, when you decided, hey, I'm going to move on from Mad Pow, I'm going to find the next thing. What triggered that for you? What was really hey, it is time for me to go on. I've learned what, you talked about learning here. Hey, I've learned what I can learn from these people. My pace of learning is a little lower. What really triggered that for you?
A big thing was so it was during the pandemic, height of the pandemic, 2020. So I joined Lirio in May of 21, and I started looking in earnest earlier that year. And part of it was the companies that were still investing in consulting were less and less in healthcare and more in financial services. So Mad Pow always did financial services work. The very first project I worked on with them was USAA. A lot of similarities to health from a behavioral perspective, but just has never excited me the way health work does. And I was just seeing, I had visibility to our sales pipeline and our client relationships. And it was just really clear to me that financial services would be an increasing piece of the pie. And that wasn't what I wanted for myself. I wasn't, I just have this sense of purpose around healthcare that I don't have around financial services. So that was a big piece of it. And Mad Pow was also acquired. And that they basically don't exist anymore. They were just folded into the parent company, one of their other brands, in the last few months. And similar to J&J, at the beginning of the acquisition, it didn't really make a big difference. It didn't feel any different showing up to work, but it was increasingly starting to feel like a different company in terms of the management and oversight. And I think it just wasn't as much of a fit for me.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, certainly Frog as it existed no longer exists in Capgemini, right?
Right.
It's now a innovation sub arm of Capgemini, right? It's
right. Well, and I'm sure too, it's really hard sometimes to be in these innovation teams because you're doing amazing work, really cool work, but it's very hard to get it back into the main product line. And that can be very frustrating because you feel like you're just doing some of the best work of your career, but then it's not really going where you think it should go.
Yeah. And there is that's a decision you make, It's almost a one-to-one trade-off in variety,
Mhm.
right? The more variety you have, the less control you have on any individual product, right? If you agree to I'm going to be the chief product officer on X thing and use behavioral science to drive that thing. I have total control, but I have own control of this thing, right? Versus at the far extreme of the other end.
Right.
Hey, I touch lots of things, but for very small amounts of time, which is often what happens as you get more senior in agencies, right? You're spending more projects, but less time
Right.
on each project. And so at some point you sort of decided, hey, like now I'm not even touching stuff enough to be able to have the impact I want.
Yeah.
And then Lirio.
Yeah. Lirio. I joined in May 21. I feel really fortunate, actually. I was aware of the company. They'd come up on my scans of the market in terms of who's doing cool behavioral science. But I had a recruiter reach out to me, and I was so I mentioned, my experience being a remote employee at J&J and not really feeling super satisfied about that. I felt really disconnected from my colleagues, and I knew this was going to be another remote job because Lirio's offices are in Tennessee and I am not. So I was resistant to it on that basis, but I, took the interviews, and it was one of those, again, sort of like magical things where as I talked to more and more of the people who are now my colleagues, I just felt that connection, like these are my people again. It reminds me a lot of health media in some of the really important ways. I think our mission's very similar to what health media's was. Our technology stack is way cooler. So that's awesome. I wanted to work with AI. I've been interested in it, and we have like a world-class AI science team, which was such a draw. But more than anything, it was that feeling of like, these are people who want to do good in the world. Like they're really thinking through an ethics lens. I asked every single person I interviewed with, like, how do you think about ethics and AI? And every single person gave me answers that showed that they were deeply thinking about that it was, front and center for their work every day. I just felt that like, I want to work with these people. I feel good about the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to hit on the remote working thing piece, because it is, there's the intersection of like remote working itself is its own thing, and then behavioral science is its own weird thing. And so like the intersection of remote and behavioral is interesting. What do you think changed in those intervening sort of 7 or 8 years between J&J and Lirio? Technologically, culturally, like what made it more possible for you in this environment?
I mean, I think it's like one of the positives of the whole COVID situation that the entire world went virtual for a bit. I think it created a lot of empathy for the virtual person because now we've all done it. And I shouldn't say it. I know there's some people whose roles haven't allowed that, but I think for the folks on this call, like the types of jobs we do, we probably all now had the experience being virtual. Where, in that earlier phase, that wasn't the case. And I mean, honestly, people would forget to put the WebEx number into a meeting invitation, and then they wouldn't realize I wasn't there. And it would be like 3 hours later, and they'd be like, oh, sorry, you were supposed to be part of this meeting and you probably prepared for it. And that doesn't happen now because we all have this understanding through lived experience that, some people aren't going to be in the room. I also think Lirio has done a really great job just thinking of ourselves as a remote first company. So we do have 2 offices in Tennessee. The Knoxville office in particular has people who work out of it. A lot of our tech teams work out of there. But for the most part, all of our meetings are set up as if every single participant will be virtual. We have a really strong culture of using Slack, of using the chat and Zooms, of socializing. Slack in particular is really good for this. Making sure that those water cooler conversations are accessible to other people. So just, the team put a lot of effort into making sure that our culture supports this virtual environment.
And do you get a chance, now that you're back in house at some place, I know you're the CBO. Yeah, finally. I love it. Yeah, we got that CBO title for you.
Yeah.
Like, are you spending any of your time focusing on the internal behavior change of Lirio? Is that something?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge part of my my role. And I think the entire executive team actually really thinking a lot about this. I mean, when you're in a small organization in an intense environment, like so much of this is about coaching people, about making sure that teams are working effectively together. Burnout is a big issue, and helping people identify how their behaviors might be contributing to burnout, how they can, address that and still accomplish the things that are important to them. I wouldn't say we treat it like we might treat a consulting project where there's like kind of a formal analysis and, collection of data and plan presented. But I think it's more of an ongoing we meet weekly as an executive team. We always talk about the culture and how things are going and what we can, be tweaking and improving. So yeah, absolutely focused on internal behavior.
Got it. I love that. We're running short on time, and we didn't even get to talk about the book. So I want to talk about the book. How did this come about? So I'll put it in the side there so people can go buy the book, because it's a fantastic book. How did the book come about? Was this something you knew? Former one semester English major, were you like, I always know I want to write the book about this? Like, where did this come about?
I've always wanted to be a writer. I remember I have a childhood diary where I wrote like, I want to be a writer, but I thought I would write novels, and it turns out I'm very bad at that. Very, very bad at that. I've tried. I was getting more through Mad Pow, especially involved in the UX and design world, because those were my colleagues. I started attending conferences that were focused on that. And I found that when I gave talks, they were really well attended. And I had a lot of interest from people who had no behavior science background, asking me, well, how do I start doing these things? And for me, a lot of times it was about the subject matter. Like I think of you as being a very process focused person. And of course, like process is important to me too. But like where I really feel like I bring something to the table is more on like the content around thinking about motivation and thinking about barriers and like, how do we apply this sort of subject matter to the process? So I was really thinking of those people as my audience. That's why I wrote with Rosenfeld. But the actual submission was a little bit of a whim. I remember it was a long holiday weekend, and I was just like on their web. I might have been buying a book or something, and I noticed they had a submit a proposal area. And it was pretty involved. Like, I don't think I would have done it if it weren't a long holiday weekend. And I remember I was like bored. You had to mock up a cover of what the book might look like, which Lou Rosenfeld later told me they were doing just to cut down on spurious applications. Like basically, if you were serious, you would be willing to go through this exercise.
It's the captcha of book proposals.
Yeah, they don't do it anymore. But I put it together and kind of like didn't think anything of it. And a few weeks later, Lou reached out. And he basically was like, this is not a book. Like, you're not there yet. But he saw the germ of the idea. He got what I was going after. And we also, I feel like, bonded really early on. We're both U of M grads, Michigan grads. So there was a lot of like, go blue. And it took longer to get the proposal accepted than it took to write the book. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of, rewriting the outline. I remember you had to put in a sample chapter, and I wrote it very academically, APA style citations and stuff, which is not the way Rosenfeld does their books. Right. So yeah, it took probably a year and a half to get that proposal into a shape where Rosenfeld felt like it could be a book. And then after that, it went much more quickly because we did have that agreed on outline. They have a fantastic editor who works with you. So I met with her every 2 weeks, and she was giving me constant feedback, and went really well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that they were willing to work with you on the sort of pounding that out. What do you think was the big difference? I mean, you talked about the academic nature versus the more conversational style. If we looked back at that early outline, mm-hmm. What's the delta between that and what finally came out as a book?
I haven't actually looked at that early outline in so long now, but I think part of it was figuring out the right start and end point of the story, like that right level of zoom for the audience. And I couldn't tell you at this point my guess, knowing myself and knowing that I was going very academic, is I probably zoomed way in on one small part of the experience. And they were like, no, you have to like zoom out and orient this within a process. I know there was also a lot of, Amy, you don't know what an outline is. This is not an outline. This is like, you put bullets into a narrative, like that doesn't make it an outline. So they wanted me to get a little bit more abstract than I was. And that was really tough for me. And I'm self-conscious about that now, because they're right. I don't know how to do an outline.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it is not a skill I do well either, right? Like I'd rather just sit down and write the damn thing than try and outline.
And that was it, right? In the outline, I'd be like, ooh, and I should include this and this and this. And the next thing I knew, I had like 3 pages.
Which is not an outline, it turns out. Now you're just writing the chapters.
Yeah, and one of the other things they actually had me do was a competitive landscape analysis too. So, what books out there might people find if they were looking on this topic? Give us a synopsis of the book and articulate how yours is different. That was very time consuming because I really wanted to get that right. And sometimes that meant revisiting the books that I thought might be out there. So
Yeah. And that I sort of heard that throughout your story. You've kind of always had a weather eye on the market, right? Whether it's finding Mad Pow or sort of doing competitive analysis at your early thing, right? That, which is very different for me. I'm very insular in some ways, right? Where often when I look at external things, it sort of infects what I'm working on, which is a good thing in some ways, but also can cause, sort of converge. It doesn't force me to sort of push in that way. But I do think I miss out on, behavioral science community is a great example of this. I meet people all the time where I'm like, I probably should have already met you. Like, how do I not already know you? Right? It's not that big of a world, but I think it's just easy sometimes to sort of get into your pocket.
well, I wonder, so a thing that's been a theme in my career that we haven't talked about, and this even goes back to the big communication days, is I've supported sales activities. And so that brings me into contact with potential clients who'll say, well, how are you different from?
Right.
So there's been like I don't know, have you done a lot of that sales stuff? I would expect that you probably had.
I have done a ton of sales stuff over my career, but because I didn't work in like the health communication space or a place where there maybe were competitors, most of the time people were more like, sorry, what do you do? Right? Like it wasn't like, how are you different from X? They're like, what even is this weird thing that you're talking about? Right? Like, early in my career when I'm going to someplace like Amex and they're like, what do you even, the notion of behavioral science, we talked to LA last time, right? And so I have this, view of Amex and how it's changed. Like there is this really interesting sort of change in terms of people's understanding of, I think now I might get more of a like, well, how is your thing different than other things? But
Yeah,
early in my
well,
career, I didn't have that.
and also think like when you were at Clover, like you probably weren't going up against a behavioral vendor.
No.
So
Right.
yeah, I maybe it's the nature of the companies I've worked for too, like who we might be competing against. But
Well, and other than Frog, I've always been internal, right? It's
Mhm.
always been an internal role. It was startups and then it was Microsoft and then it was Clover, right? Like,
Right.
it's been internally focused where the biggest thing I'm competing against is the status quo. It's not some other alternative future, right? Like I have vendor A or vendor B, but both are different than what I'm doing today. It's we're doing a thing. Why would we do anything different than the thing that we've done?
Right. Right.
Right. And so that's a lot of what I'm teaching is evolution from the current process as opposed to comparison to an alternative vendor.
Yes. Yeah, and that's interesting because as much as I say I'm supporting sales, honestly, with our clients or potential clients, what comes up more often is why should we use a personalization platform like yours when we have Epic Cheers or Salesforce Marketing Cloud or Salesforce Journey Builder? Sorry, where we get the questions about alternative vendors is more from like our investors, our board. Hey, I saw this company got funded. What are they about? So they keep me on my toes a little bit with that marketplace scan. With the customers, it's more about we understand what your legacy technology is able to do, and here is how we are beyond that in these behavioral ways.
Right. And so what's next for Amy in the world, right? Is there another book in the offing? Is there
I'm not ready for that yet. I think I would love to write another book one day. The other thing about my book too, like I wrote it in 2019 and it was, I mean, this too. It's so time consuming when you do that. It was like nights and weekends. And I remember saying to my husband, I turned in the final draft in like the early fall, but then edits and stuff took up until the end of 2019 and it came out in March 2020. And I remember saying to my husband, okay, 2020, we can like finally have fun, set loose. We're going to do it. We had a great vacation plan for April. We're going to go to Peru for 2 weeks and like be in the Amazon. Like we're going to spend tons of time with our friends. Cause basically this whole last year, I deprived you of a social life by sitting here writing this book. I'm not quite emotionally recovered from that. Like I do want to do it again. I enjoyed it, but I think I just am not ready.
I hear that. There was a great question that was asked in the chat here, which was about what gave you the confidence to follow your passions as to especially when there wasn't an existing team.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think of you as someone who's very tenacious and confident, right? I think
Well,
you move boldly in the environment, which I like and enjoy, and it's why I like you so much. What do you think helped you do that, right? Do you think it's just personality and you're born that way? Do you think there were experiences that made it easier? Like, Tell me a little bit about that.
My mom tells a story about how when I was like pre-verbal, she asked the pediatrician if there was something wrong with me because I was so stubborn. So I think I do have a personality trait that's been there my whole life. But I didn't feel confident. There have been so many times in my career where I haven't felt confident, and I have done something, despite that, because it felt like the best option on the table. I think a lot about, even on the Lirio page, like we all had to choose a quote, and there's one from Mencius that I really like, which is, you can't straighten others without bending yourself, or basically it's being true to yourself, not worrying so much about other people. I find that those sorts of quotes and positions really resonate with me. And I find myself thinking of those things when it's time for me to make decisions for myself. Like, tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be in my own skin. And can I feel good about the decisions I've made, even if other people might not? It's not easy. Like I struggle a lot with it. I struggle a lot, even as a manager sometimes, when I have to make a decision that I feel like is truly the right one, but I know it's not going to make the people who I lead feel happy, because I do feel this awareness of what other people need, want, expect from me. And I hate letting people down. I find I have to do a lot of work about, boundary setting and things that feels very uncomfortable for me. But ultimately, I just keep coming back to, like, can I feel good about this? Can I live with myself having done this? And there's come a point with some of this career stuff where it's like, I have to put myself first and do the thing that I enjoy, even if other people don't think that's the right thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that has led you on this sort of wonderful journey, and that you've been able to stay relatively committed to health, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine alternate, the fictional in all of us, you can imagine alternative worlds where you get sucked into, finance or product development or, other kinds of things.
Yeah.
And you have had one of those careers that has stayed really true to an industry. Do you think that that's all? I mean, do you think it's sort of health till you die?
I think so. I think the work health is such a mess. I think there will always be work for behavioral scientists in the healthcare space, whether it's, helping people with their behaviors directly, which of course is a huge area of passion for me. But I mean, the industry is so screwed up in so many ways. And there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, even think about the technology that gets used by different types of healthcare organizations. Like, I really like working for a health tech company because I love having that lens on how healthcare gets delivered and what the patient experience is. So yeah, I don't see any shortage of future work. And my goal right now would be, health till I die.
I love it. Well, Amy, thanks so much for joining me and spending some time with me. I always celebrate the time that we get to spend together.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate the invitation. I was, delighted when you reached out, and I love what you're building here with this community too. Like, just seeing all the names on the screen, and I've seen some of your names around before, so I'm like really pleased, even if I didn't get to hear a lot about you, but like just to begin a relationship.
Well, to your point, I mean, you and I started in a lonely time,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're maybe a little older than some of the youngins. Like, and it's hard to describe to them how lonely it really was. I mean, there was, people, you spent, your whole year on your own.
Well, and to that question about like what gives you the confidence when there wasn't broad legitimacy, it's like, well, what was the alternative?
Right. Academia, which is terrifying. The alternatives, there is, it is a partially, I definitely know I don't want this other thing. You mentioned them talking to you about it. Before I went to Cornell, Tom Gilovich called me and said, "You keep talking about applied stuff, and I just want to make sure we don't really, it's not really what academia is." Like, he knew it long before I did, in the same way that school advisors sort of knew it long before you did. And there is that listening to other people, not letting them dissuade you from your course, but trying to listen to their feedback and what they're genuinely recognizing in you. Well, Amy, thanks so much for coming and spending time with me. I'm going to try and talk you into teaching a class at some point.
Hey, I'm working on the boundaries. I can't do it all, so I've got to.
I know. I said in time. It's
all right. In time.
We read a book. We do a micro course.
Okay.
We've just released the first of the courses on Learn Applied BeSci, but we are actively, getting other people in there because, this is a community, and the more that we can learn from other people, the better. Hey, everybody, Amy is fantastic. If you ever get a chance to meet her at a conference or get a chance to interact with her, please do spend the time. Amy, thanks so much for coming with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to you soon. Okay.
All right. Talk to y'all later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.